Joining me in the studio now is TalkTV political correspondent Alicia Fitzgerald. Hi, Alicia. And down the line is the assistant editor at the Spectator, Cindy Yu. Good to have you both on board. Let me start with you, Alicia, just to set the scene here. We hear from Oliver Dowden there, you know, there's no harm done. Nothing has really been achieved by the Chinese doing what they tried to do. And most... I don't know what to say about this. I think he hopes that it's bracing and kind of firm and inspiring. You know, we will call them out on this. You know, we will make no bones about the fact that they really are not to do this. Naughty, 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 naughty China. Don't do it because we're very, very cross. Are we going to punish you in any way? No. Is there anything we can do to stop you doing it again? No. Are we even going to threaten you with anything? No, we're not. We're just going to say, don't do that again. It all seems to me feeble, and it feels as if we're not necessarily getting the full picture here.
Well, the issue is this threat of China is something that's been murmuring for quite some time now. The Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament discuss it semi-regularly, and every time when it comes to the big question, do we label China as a malicious state? Do we label it as a threat? It usually boils down to no. Why? Because we actually rely on China so much, and China have become such a powerful player in the world stage.
And when you say we rely on China so much, you mean as a manufacturer of cheap goods? What else do we rely on China for?
I mean, particularly that technology. I mean, iPhones, all of these things, like all of the parts, everything, pretty much most things seem to come from China.
But we're their customer, though. They're not our customer.
True, but what's the alternative? That's the thing. So it's like, you know, you can say, well, China's a threat and we can worsen our relationship with China, but then what? What is the alternative? And at the moment, there doesn't seem to be one. The other issue politically is that if you start labelling China as a threat or a malicious state, does that then worsen our already deteriorating relationship with the Chinese officials? And the answer is probably yes.
Let me bring Cindy Yu into this. Cindy, thank you so much for joining us. Tell me how worrying, how sinister, how much foreboding we should feel at the news of China doing what it's done and what it did in 2021. And the idea that, well, nothing much to see here, nothing really happened, everyone's fine, nobody's details were used or abused, so forget, move on, and wag a finger at China and tell them not to do it again, would almost seem as if this is something that was rather slight and is now done and dusted. But I don't think it really feels that way, does it?
No, I don't think it does feel that way. And there are two attacks that we're talking about here. There's one that's on the Electoral Commission, which has compromised the data of 40 million voters. And there's another one, which Dowden said was absolutely unsuccessful, which basically tried to hack into the email accounts of a number of parliamentarians, 3 or 4 of them. Now, I'm less worried about that second one because as politicians, unfortunately, that is what they had to deal with from different countries all over the world. And they have the higher security capacity to deal with that. And that's why that attempt was unsuccessful. I'm quite worried about the Electoral Commission one, though, because you suggested earlier, Vanessa, that we're not getting the full picture. And to some extent, we never would with this kind of intelligence question. But it didn't feel to me like from Dowden's statement that he was speaking to the people involved. You know, I probably have my details on the open register. You probably have yours as well, because people generally don't tick the anonymous box. But what does that mean for those people? And especially, I'm concerned from the views of the critics of the Chinese Communist Party in this country, especially the Hong Kong refugees that we've taken in the last few years, over 125,000 of them. I would have liked Dowden to say a little bit more about that. And to be fair to him, he did talk about the ways in which MI5 would help businesses and individuals counter the Chinese cyber threat. But anecdotally, from people that I've spoken to who've tried to make use of that MI5 service, they found this a bit of a dialing tone kind of situation where they're not actually getting through to immediate help very quickly.
Tell me, Cindy, what is it that people whose data has been accessed should fear? Is it kind of mind games that the Chinese insidiously, subtly and undetectably will try to influence, for example, the way people vote? And if they do, how on earth they do that, I've got absolutely no idea, but that's one of the implications. Or is it something else? What is the worry? What are we concerned about here, would you say?
Look, Vanessa, it's important to caveat, first of all, that I'm not a cybersecurity expert on this one. But from what we do know of the story is that this kind of data is personal details such as who's registered to vote, what their addresses are, perhaps who else is in their household. So it's less about influencing how they would vote, because knowing that data doesn't necessarily help you with that, but more about maybe personal data of where individuals live and are. As I say, if I were a refugee from Hong Kong who was involved in the Hong Kong protests and now come to seek refuge in the UK, I would be quite concerned about the Chinese state having that data. At the same time, I have to say, we live in a very complicated grey world. Security services know all sorts of stuff that we as ordinary citizens don't know that they do know. And then it takes a leak like the Edward Snowden leaks or WikiLeaks for us to find out just the extent to which all of this data is out there. So again, as I say, I'm not a cybersecurity expert, so it could be that all of this data is out there already. And when Dowden was questioned, what does China want from all of this? He actually couldn't really answer. So it's not clear, I think, what they were really hoping to get, because it's certainly not financial gain, but also, as I say, it wouldn't influence anyone's voting habits. So what is it? And I think that's a big hanging question, basically.
Yes, and Alicia, the implication is, and I don't know whether you consider it to be true or not, but the implication is that the Chinese really excel at this, that they are the world superpower when it comes to this kind of infiltration of other information, spying and espionage and all that kind of stuff, and that we just by definition are much less good at it, more plodding, more leaden, less subtle, so we don't reciprocate in kind, or if we do, we don't do it as well as they do. Is that the kind of received wisdom on this?
Yes, sadly it is. And I think Cindy made a really good point there about the fact that maybe this information is already things that China have access to. Well, remember that TikTok, which is a Chinese-owned social media platform, was banned in Parliament last year, and the USA are even talking about banning it in the whole of the United States of America, which would be a really significant move. And the reason for that is compromise of data. And the data that people are putting in there, people think that might be potentially being used by China for some kind of gain. Again, though, that is the issue. We don't really know what it's being weaponized for, but what we do know is that it's clearly being done on purpose for some reason. So that's the worrying side.
All right, Cindy, what do you think of Oliver Dowden sort of slightly showing his teeth? But when I say slightly, I mean, desperately, unconvincingly, a bit like a parent saying, if you don't go to bed immediately, young lady, I'm going to have to take away your pocket money. They don't really mean it. It really did feel on that level. We've made absolutely no bones about telling the Chinese, up with this, we will not put. It's like, well, what do you mean? Why would they care less about that? I mean, what do you think of that in terms of international power play? Don't do it again. We don't like it. Stop it.
Look, Oliver Dowden is not necessarily the fiercest of politicians that you could roll out on the Conservative benches or even the government benches, for example. Security Minister Tom Tugendhat, for example, has been known to be much more vocal about his criticism of China in the past. But, Vanessa, I have to say, yes, there is a benefit in telling China off, in upholding our interests and basically saying this is not on. But there's also a limit to that in the sense that how effective will that be and how much is it talking a bigger game than you're actually doing? So for me, it's not so much about the rhetoric that we're seeing as private citizens out in the public sphere, but more about the stuff that has teeth behind the scenes. Who are these people that they've sanctioned? How strict are the sanctions? What is the resilience building mechanisms for the Electoral Commission and for individual MPs and for individual citizens that they've talked about? Are we really tackling the Chinese threat in reality? I don't care so much about the rhetoric because, frankly, a lot of the politicians can just talk over each other like that, and China's very good at a fierce rhetoric as well. But really, what's happening behind the scenes in terms of making us more resilient against this Chinese challenge, that's the bigger question, I think.
And it's quite hard to think about or quantify when we're not really quite sure of the level of threat, isn't it? We're not absolutely certain what it is we think they're trying to do, whether we think they've succeeded in doing it. When you can't identify the threat itself, then this makes it a very notional kind of conversation, not going very far, Cindy, doesn't it?
I think part of the things that we could do is cutting reliance, and then that's something that the government has been doing a bit better in the last few years. So Oliver Dowden mentioned the removal of Chinese investment in Sizewell C, that nuclear plant, for example. There are other live issues such as Chinese investment in the UK's battery making capacity for EVs in the future, which will become such an important supply chain, such an important industry in the future. So we protecting ourselves from future reliance as well. So that's one thing, to Alicia's point about how much we rely on China. We can try to basically reduce that reliance. I think we can also basically give people a bit more education, especially when it comes to universities and private businesses who have a lot of dealing with Chinese actors. Do they know what is beyond the red line? Do they know what kind of information they should share and what kind of information that could be used for malicious intent? That's a kind of educational side of things that we could also do. But yes, Vanessa, you're right. We're not calling them a threat. And I think part of that is because the UK wants to be in line with the US on this. And the US has been warming up its relations with China over the last few months, TikTok aside, in general. I think there is a collective action question here as well, where the UK doesn't want to be stepping out of line by itself.
Cindy, thank you very much indeed.